The old man hit the pavement so hard that the sound of his body striking the stone sidewalk made everyone around him stop for half a second. But only one person ran toward him. Sarah Miller had been carrying 2 coffee trays outside the luxury hotel where she worked, already exhausted, after spending the night awake beside her 8-year-old daughter, Grace, who had been coughing through a fever. Her supervisor had warned her that morning that one more mistake could cost her the job, and Sarah knew exactly what that meant. No job meant no rent, no groceries, and possibly no home for her little girl. Yet when she saw the elderly man lying helplessly near the curb, struggling to breathe while expensive cars rolled past him, Sarah dropped the trays without thinking. What would you have done if helping a stranger meant risking the only job keeping your child safe? Sarah never imagined that one decision would change her life forever. She rushed to the man's side and knelt beside him, ignoring the pain in her knees and the expensive coffee soaking into the pavement. The man looked terrified, his gray hair disheveled, his breathing shallow. Sarah immediately called 911 and kept one hand beneath his head while asking him to stay awake. She noticed a small medical bracelet around his wrist and carefully told the dispatcher everything she could see. A few people gathered, but nobody stepped forward. Sarah remained there, speaking gently to him, reminding him that help was coming. When the paramedics arrived, they recognized him immediately. His name was Robert Hayes, a respected 76-year-old businessman, and the father of Michael Hayes, one of the wealthiest CEOs in Chicago. Sarah didn't know any of that. To her, he was simply an old man who needed someone to care enough to stop. But when Sarah returned to the hotel, soaked from the rain and shaking from adrenaline, her supervisor was waiting. The broken coffee trays had already been reported. Sarah tried to explain what happened, but her supervisor didn't want an explanation. He told her that the hotel had important guests, schedules mattered, and employees couldn't simply abandon their responsibilities. Sarah begged for another chance, explaining that she had a sick daughter at home and desperately needed the job. Instead, she was handed her final paycheck and told to leave. Sarah walked out carrying the small cardboard box containing her belongings, trying desperately not to cry until she reached the corner. Then she sat on a bench and finally broke down. She pressed her hands against her face and whispered that she was sorry to Grace, even though her daughter wasn't there to hear her. That evening, Sarah returned to the tiny apartment she shared with Grace, with only a loaf of bread and a few dollars in her purse. Grace was sitting under a blanket, waiting for her mother with worried eyes. Sarah forced a smile and told her everything was going to be okay. But children often understand more than adults realize. Grace noticed the empty hands, the tired eyes, and the cardboard box. She quietly asked whether her mother had lost her job. Sarah nodded, and Grace wrapped her arms around her mother's waist. Sarah held her tightly and cried into her daughter's hair. She felt ashamed, frightened, and completely defeated. She had spent years working every job she could find after Grace's father disappeared from their lives, always promising her daughter that they would never end up on the streets. Now that promise felt painfully fragile. The next morning, Sarah began searching for work. She applied everywhere, but the bills were already waiting. Her rent was due in 4 days. The electricity notice sat on the kitchen counter, and Grace needed medicine. Sarah didn't know that across the city, Robert Hayes was asking his son to find the woman who had saved his life. Michael had rushed to the hospital after receiving the call that his father had collapsed. The doctors told him that Robert's condition could have become fatal if someone hadn't acted quickly. Robert remembered Sarah's face, her trembling hands, and the way she refused to leave him alone. He told Michael that while everyone else had walked past, one struggling woman had stopped without knowing who he was. Michael initially thought finding her would be simple. Security footage from the area showed Sarah helping his father, and eventually they discovered where she worked. But when Michael arrived at the hotel, he learned that Sarah had been fired. He asked why. The supervisor proudly explained that she had abandoned her duties and caused a costly mess. Michael stared at him in disbelief. Then he asked where Sarah was. Nobody knew. Michael's expression hardened when he realized that the woman who had saved his father had been punished for doing exactly what any decent human being should have done. After several hours of searching, Michael finally found Sarah at a small grocery store, counting coins while Grace stood beside her. Sarah was embarrassed when he introduced himself. She assumed he had come because of the hotel incident and expected another accusation. Instead, Michael told her that his father was alive because of her. Sarah shook her head and said she had only done what anyone should have done. Michael looked at the woman standing in worn sneakers with her little girl holding her hand and realized that she had no idea how extraordinary her choice had been. He offered Sarah money, but she hesitated. She didn't want charity. She had spent years surviving without asking anyone for pity. Michael understood and changed his offer. He told her about a community outreach foundation his company operated and offered her a paid position coordinating emergency assistance programs for struggling families. The salary was more than she had ever earned, but the part that mattered most was that the work would allow her to help people like the man she had stopped for that day. Sarah accepted, but only after making sure she had earned the position. Months passed, and Sarah slowly rebuilt her life. Grace's health improved, their apartment became warmer and brighter, and for the first time in years Sarah wasn't terrified every time the phone rang. Robert visited her workplace often, not as a powerful businessman, but as the grateful old man whose life she had changed. He eventually became like family to Sarah and Grace. One afternoon, he gave Grace a small wooden music box and told her that her mother had reminded him that wealth meant nothing if a person had no compassion. Sarah listened, quietly, tears filling her eyes. The hotel supervisor eventually learned who Sarah had saved and what Michael had done for her. He apologized, but Sarah didn't celebrate his regret. She simply told him that she hoped someday he would understand that people were more important than broken coffee trays and perfect schedules. She didn't want revenge. She had already learned something more valuable, that losing one door didn't mean every door was closed. Years later, Sarah stood outside the foundation's new community center as Grace. Now, a confident teenager, cut the ribbon. The building had been created to provide food, emergency housing assistance, job training, and support for single parents. Michael stood nearby with his father, Robert, smiling proudly. Sarah looked at the building and remembered the woman she had been on that rainy sidewalk, the frightened mother who thought she had lost everything. She realized she hadn't lost everything that day. She had discovered exactly who she was. Sometimes life asks us to choose between protecting what we have and doing what is right. Sometimes kindness costs us something before it gives anything back. Sarah had lost her job because she stopped to help a stranger, but that stranger's son had given her something no paycheck could ever provide: a second chance, a purpose, and the reminder that one small act of compassion can travel farther than we will ever know. Before the story ends, tell me in the comments, if you were Sarah, would you have stopped to help the old man even if you knew you might lose your job? And if this story truly touched your heart, please like, comment, share it with someone who needs a little hope today, and subscribe for more emotional stories about kindness, second chances, and the people who quietly change lives.